We welcome everyone to the first edition of the Assessment Day, an event conceived and organized by São Paulo Open Center with the special support of Cambridge Assessment English. I'm Fátima Trindade, founder and director of São Paulo Open Center. We truly believe that assessment is the bridge between teaching and learning, and is an essential part of educational process for the whole life. In this moment of pandemic that ravaged the world, impacting everyone and especially education, our attention turned to the learning process of children and adolescents, and in particular of our students who need special support. In this meeting today, we are reflecting on the theme, challenges of assessing children's and teenagers' English language development. In the morning, we had a very interesting discussion with a lot of ideas about how to support and assess learners with specific learning differences. Now we are going to discuss about how to assess our young learners. With the presence and contribution of nationally and internationally renowned professionals, we are having a program that will certainly collaborate with our local and personal challenges. This is undoubtedly a very sensitive and important topic for our pedagogical practice and for the special context that we are all living because of the impact of the pandemic in our lives. I hope we have a session of many exchanges and that we leave inspired to return to the second semester classes for those who are in Brazil and proceed with our classroom work along the year, and for those who are in other parts of the world too. Thank for you join us from Mexico, Argentina, US, Spain, and all over Brazil. Have a great session.
Thank you, Fatima. Hello, everyone. Welcome back for our afternoon sessions. I am Marcia Fernandes, Pedagogical Coordinator at São Paulo Open Center, and I will be with you in between the speakers and presenting everyone. Before we even begin, I would like to give you some housekeeping tips. So first of all, our event is divided in 4 parts. We are having the third and the final part now in the afternoon with 2 separate links. We're going to tell you when it's time to move on to our last link for the roundtable panel with our 2 speakers of the afternoon in the right time. Also, please address all your questions to our speakers using the Q&A functionality of Zoom, and use the chat box for making comments and interacting with other speakers, with all the speakers, with the panelists, and other attendees. Our event is being recorded, and the recordings will be made available in São Paulo Open Center's YouTube channel soon. And also digital certificates of attendance will be sent by email next week. Lastly, bear in mind that we are relying on personal Wi-Fi connections, and most of our panelists and presenters, they are delivering their presentations from home. So please ignore some background noises or technical issues that we might face. And to begin our session this afternoon, I would like to welcome Marianne Nikolov. She's having a presentation on the topic of feedback and assessment for learning in the Young Learner and EFL Classroom, how to tune teaching to children's needs. So Marianne Nikolov is a professor emerita of English Applied Linguistics at the University of Pécs, Hungary. Earlier in her career, she taught English as a foreign language to young learners for 18 years. She taught in BA and MA TEFL and PhD courses, and is still working with doctoral students. Her research interests include the age factor, early learning and teaching of modern languages, assessment of processes and outcomes in language education, individual differences such as aptitude, attitudes, and motivation contributing to language development, teacher education, teachers' beliefs and practices, and language policy. Her publications include longitudinal classroom research, large-scale national assessment projects, as well as case studies. So, Marianne, welcome to our afternoon sessions, to our assessment day. It's a pleasure to have you here with us.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It is my pleasure and honor to be part of this event. And I gave this title to the presentation to try to align my talk to what I perceive to be the needs of most teachers who teach young learners. So here is a short overview of what I would like to talk about. First of all, I'll emphasize that teaching, learning, and assessment of young learners is always part of the same story, just as you have just mentioned. I will discuss the aims and conditions of successful early foreign language programs, some of the things that I wish I had known when I started out as a teacher of young learners without any background training as to how they learn or how you can boost their proficiency, how you can make sure that they maintain their motivation, etc. I will propose widening the scope of assessment for learning to also include feedback for learning. And I will want to share a few results of a diagnostic testing project implemented in Hungary a few years ago and come up with a few classroom implications, which I hope will be relevant for everyone who is listening. So first of all, let me remind ourselves of the aims of early foreign language programs. I will keep using foreign language English L2 interchangeably. In most of the cases, the research concerns only English, but there is some research on other languages. So the aims tend to focus on language aims, first of all, to achieve communicative competence in the target language, including listening, speaking, as well as literacy. When we try to think in terms of what levels these young learners are supposed to achieve, they tend to be A1 and A2, but sometimes some children may achieve even higher levels. Typically, affective aims are also listed. These include positive attitudes towards the target language, the speakers of the language, and their culture, as well as their language learning motivation, self-confidence, self-concept, willingness to communicate, and of course, we want low anxiety all the time. There are certain cognitive aims typically defined in curricula. These tend to include certain strategies, but they also refer to metacognition in relation to the first language, as well as what they can do in other subject matters. Then social aims are also typically included. These include social skills, and most curricula point out that equal opportunities are among the aims. Now, if you think about what is typically measured, it's clear that in most contexts, it tends to be only the target language and none of the others. I would like to talk about the conditions of successful early foreign language programs, just to remind ourselves of how they actually work. Well, first of all, one of the key conditions concerns opportunities to learn and use the target language in school as well as outside school. So what Krashen called comprehensible input has to be also complemented by opportunities to interact in the target language and to understand what's going on, usually relying on contextual keys as well as background knowledge. Home literacy practices in the first language are very important before we go into discussing learning a new language. And these, we know from research, are very often determined to a large extent by the children's socioeconomic status. If we want to generalize, age-appropriate curricula are necessary, which are implemented well in whatever context the children live. They need sufficient time to develop proficiency in the target language in all 4 skills. Literacy will be a must over time. And we simply have to remind ourselves that in the target language context, where, for example, English is used on a daily basis and children are immersed in the target language context, they attend school in the target language, native-like proficiency, age-appropriate proficiency tends to take 2 to 7 years for children. So in a foreign language context, obviously, you need a longer time. It is important to emphasize that the younger the children are, the slower they are. And this is something that I wish I had known when I started out, because teachers tend to worry a lot. Why do children develop so slowly? Is it my fault? Am I doing something inappropriately? Should I be changing my practice so that they could speed up? No, the younger they are, the slower they tend to be. Now, when we think in terms of individual differences, predictors of successful target language development tend to include aptitude, motivation maintained over time, first language skills, and socioeconomic status. And of course, there are some others, but I will not elaborate on all of these. And we know that in foreign language programs, key players include teachers. They have to be motivated to teach the target language as well as the age group. They have to be motivated to work with young learners. They need to be proficient both in the target language and the children's first language. Otherwise, they will find it really difficult to work on meaning making because they can't understand the feedback that the children give. And they need strong instructional skills, which include both teaching and classroom management. This is not an easy job, as we all know. Now, if we think about the construct of early English, it tends to be a continuum between the target language and the content that is taught in the target language. And some of you may be aware of the recent shift away from the traditional foreign language curriculum towards content-based teaching or content and language integrated learning models, because if you start early, what used to be very motivating at the beginning may become terribly boring once the children are exposed to the very same topics and the very same activities over time. Now, language proficiency, the construct, actually includes what it includes for everybody else, not just young learners: language knowledge and strategic competence, which means the ability to use the target language communicatively. The key construct concerns tasks. The tasks that the children are expected to be able to do, they have to be age appropriate, cognitively challenging, but also intrinsically motivating, and they need to include all the 4 skills so that they can develop as well as document the typically slow progress, as I mentioned, the younger, the slower, along the years when they are developing their proficiency in the target language. It's also important to point out that whatever the construct is, we need to make sure that the children also use self-assessment. They become aware of what they can do and how well they can do that. And of course, teacher assessment is always part of the game. Now, I would simply like to remind ourselves who the young learners are and how they learn. Young language learners today include a very wide age range. It's quite shocking that some publications include children from the ages of 2, more typically from 6 to 12, and sometimes, depending on the school system, even up to 14. Now, the differences between a 6-year-old and a 12-year-old, I don't have to point that out to anybody who has seen this age group. Most of the groups tend to be mixed abilities. There are large individual differences and variation and variability in what the children can do. In very general terms, if I want to sum up how children learn languages, I need to emphasize that children need to be engaged all the time in meaning-focused, intrinsically motivating, as well as cognitively challenging pedagogical tasks, which are tuned to their background knowledge and L1 literacy in contexts that are familiar to them or can become familiar to them by sharing common ground and shared attention. In interaction with others, others include the teacher as well as their peers, and the teacher can scaffold their development by focusing on meaning, first of all, and focusing on form based on diagnostic data. And that is, in a nutshell, what I think I wish I had known when I was a beginner. Now, I would like to point out how children learn in two complementary ways. There are two systems. One is memory-based, which actually never dies. It works in adults as well, but is so typical in young learners. This means the acquisition of chunks or unanalyzed wholes. And also, they can learn based on rules, and that's the complementary system, which becomes more dominant as they grow older and as their cognition develops. The younger the learners are, the more they tend to rely on memory-based learning, the less they can apply rule-based learning, the slower their L2 development or any language development, and the more important motivation is in the classroom. In fact, motivation over time, over the many years, is the key to success in early language programs. There is typically a dynamic interaction between teacher and peers as models, and with my colleague, we proposed a special framework for studying this, but today that's not the focus of my discussion, but in the references, I will give you some reading if anybody is interested. Now, the conference is about challenges. Now, what are the main challenges that teachers of young learners face on a daily basis? First of all, how to balance fluency and accuracy, which we know they both develop through errors. When children make errors, teachers tend to be worried because, like I used to, I always thought that I was not doing a good job because children made mistakes. However, we know that language learning, just like learning anything else, is about errors, and errors indicate development. It's important to realize that development tends to be U-shaped. What the children can do today well, they may not be so good at doing tomorrow or next week. And then even if you think, well, it's a lost battle, somehow a few weeks later, they become really good at whatever the focus of practice was. So U-shaped development is something that teachers have to bear in mind. It's not because they want to forget, but because this is the normal curve of learning. And also I would like to point out that the relationship between the two languages, in case children are monolingual and they start learning another language, but sometimes they already have two, sometimes even three languages in their mind, whichever language they have in their mind, they interact with the new target language. And the relationships tend to be based on research on Hungarian learners, quite strong at the beginning, and they become somewhat weaker over time. If anybody is interested, I can come up with some account of this. Now, the main challenge for the teacher is how to find out what the children know and can do today, how we can integrate what they know into the program, how we can shift from implicit, that is chunk learning, to rule-based learning, explicit learning, how we can scaffold their learning individually in those large, sometimes enormous groups, and how to assess slow progress over time and still maintain the children's motivation as well as, and I would like to emphasize this, the teacher's motivation. The maintaining our own motivation is as important as working with children and motivating them all the time. Now, I'm trying to frame Young Learners assessment in light of a recent shift in early English assessment, which has been pushed forward because of accountability and assessment. So much money and effort has been invested in starting English programs at an earlier point, as well as putting so much work into developing curricula, teaching materials, and as we are talking about assessment, some assessment tools, that this is now driving this recent shift of English becoming, early English becoming a very important area, which like 40 years ago, nobody would have expected to be the case. There is a very basic distinction between assessment of learning, which used to be also called as summative assessment. That is, when we are interested in what the students can do at the end of a certain period, and assessment for learning or formative assessment, which I will keep also using diagnostic or learning oriented assessment. These are the recent trends where focus has been on what's going on a daily basis and how can we integrate teaching, learning, assessment so that we scaffold children's development from where they are, even in large groups. There are two terms that I would like to just mention. I'm sure you are familiar with them. One is called teacher's diagnostic competence. The other term, largely overlapping with this, is language assessment literacy. Both of them concern how teachers are able not only to test what learners can do, but also to deal with what they learn from the assessment and build the lessons they have learned into the learning and teaching process. They also include teachers' views and beliefs about how children develop and how their own attitudes and motivation interact with what they can expect from children. This is something that is rarely discussed. It counts what we expect from them. So overall, I would like to frame this whole assessment procedures as how teachers teach and assess children over the years and how they can benefit from gaining new insights into the daily development based on whatever tasks they use with the children. And the key terms are tasks or activities. These are the two things that we typically use in our teaching. These concern what young learners do in class or as home assignment. And very often we have very little idea as to what they do beyond these. If you have young children, the age you teach, you have to be aware of the fact that they do many things we as children never did, or I never did, because those opportunities were simply not available. But we are here more concerned with what young learners do in the class, because that's what we have, we think, control over, and tasks that we can assign them so that they can do them at home individually or with their buddies or sometimes with their parents. These tasks and activities are generally supposed to be beneficial, in other words, conducive to learning. There are certain activities, for example, games or coloring or using TPR activities, listening to stories in picture books, telling rhymes, singing songs, playing round games, where there is feedback typically offered, usually holistic. Yes, well done, this was great, but the results cannot be and are not quantified. In other words, children are having fun, children are doing what they are invited to do, and they enjoy doing those activities, but there is no specific outcome except for the song is over. This was many decades ago, the actual approach to assessing young learners. Have fun, don't worry about testing them, just let them enjoy what they are doing. However, by today, we have moved over to tasks where we want to be able to quantify what children can do, because that's what assessment is about. Now, tasks by definition tend to be similar to real life tasks. What children as children or as adults may be required to be able to do. They tend to be, if the learners are young, meaning focused. They tend to have a clear purpose and a clear outcome. Those outcomes need to be measurable, and the basics concern the fact that a task, if it's good for teaching, it also has to be good for assessment, and the other way around. We should never think in terms of assessing young learners by using any test that is not good for a pedagogical, in other words, teaching purpose. Now, I introduced the terms of assessment of and for learning, although I'm sure everybody has been familiar with the distinctions, but I would like to simply point out that only the aims are different. Achievement or proficiency tests versus progress tests, they tap into what children can do, but the purpose of these tests is different. The actual tasks or tests, and I'm using these two terms interchangeably, may be the same. The question is when and how they are administered, and this is how they are different, and how the results are used. Again, the results can be used in a different way. Now, in the case of assessment for learning or diagnostic assessment, the results are immediately available in order to support learning so that children can know right away what they did correctly and what they did not hit right on. Assessment for learning can focus on the individual or on the group. It tends to focus on meaning, and form should come only as a follow-up. And of course, this is again dependent on the age. And these types of tasks or tests need to be frequent and low stakes. Children have nothing to lose. They can do the same task if they wish, or a very similar task as many times as they feel the need for, and of course, as many times as the teacher has the energy for offering the same or similar tasks. Now, assessment and feedback for learning actually concerns feedback as something with a wider scope than assessment, because whatever children do in the classroom, they tend to get either explicit or implicit feedback on. Not all curricula include tests, and we know that some of them don't, or maybe at the very early stage they don't. However, teachers always give feedback, if only well done, or that was a good job. That's also feedback. It can be also, of course, negative. Now, feedback for learning concerns the purpose of scaffolding young learners' development. We want them to become aware where the gaps are so that they can work on the gaps. And if we give them a new opportunity, they can then bridge the gap. And this is the part of the teaching cycle. We are interested in how tasks work. We give children feedback. We try to tune the tasks exactly where the learners are, and this is precious information for the teacher. I want to know where they are, and I want to give them individual diagnostic feedback on similar tasks, and then set more challenging tasks based on what they could already do. And the sources of feedback, of course, include not only the teacher, but the learner who can reflect on their own achievements, as well as peers. Of course, there is a footnote there that peers can be not only supportive, but they can be also critical. So the teacher has to be careful how children give one another feedback, that's part of a slightly different story. Now, when we think in terms of the teacher's feedback for learning, it is always for the individual learner, but it can be also worded for the actual group about what they can do, how well they can do it, what they cannot yet do, and how they can be better at doing it. And you can ask the children to reflect on this, obviously not in the target language because they wouldn't be able to do that. And the feedback informs peers about who can do what, how they can scaffold one another's learning, how they can compare to one another, and to some criterion, that is, what is the mastery level of that particular task. Now, we can also think in terms of the learner's feedback for learning. So the feedback for the actual learner is for self-reflection, like how well can I do one thing or the other, and how the tasks work for the teacher and the peers. And here I am already talking about a project where we were interested in finding out how interesting and boring the tasks are, how easy and challenging they are, how familiar and unfamiliar they are. We can teach children to think in terms of these three criteria about each and every task they can or cannot do, so that they can become more aware of why. And finally, peers' feedback for learning informs children in the group about who can do what and how well, so that they can, for example, ask somebody for help. If the other kid can do something well, that kid can tutor the other kid. Kids know very well why the other children don't succeed. They can give very good explanations, obviously not in the target language, and they can scaffold one another's learning very successfully. And they also become aware of how they compare to one another, and this may boost autonomy. However, feedback may also induce anxiety. So we have to be very careful how children word their feedback to one another. Now I would like to switch to a large-scale diagnostic assessment project we implemented in Hungary. And I will cut this quite short, but I'm hoping to evoke some interest in the findings. We wanted to find out how 319 tests worked for children between grades 2 to 6. And we wanted to find out how the relationships between the students' test scores, task familiarity, task difficulty, and likability compared to one another. I will not bore you with the details. We also wanted to find out what the teachers thought about the actual tasks or tests, and what beliefs and practices their content reflected, and what lessons and implications we can draw from classroom practice. By definition, this was a mixed method study because we had a lot of quantitative data as well as qualitative, mostly in terms of the teachers' open comments on the actual tests. There were two phases. We had over 2,000 students filling in test booklets in 161 groups at 26 schools which volunteered, and the children were in grades 2 to 7, overwhelmingly 2 to 6, but some of them in grade 7, and they were grouped according to 3 estimated levels, depending on how long they had been learning English and what proficiency level the teachers thought the children would be. Each test booklet, including 20 tasks, was filled in by over 120 students, and we included 61 teachers, and 41 teachers filled in the questionnaire. In the second phase, there were some case studies conducted by 2 colleagues who included a smaller number of teachers and young learners with a slightly different focus, but use the very same tasks. So in phase 1, each teacher worked with their own groups of children. They got the test booklets, including 5 listening, 5 speaking, 5 reading, and 5 writing tasks geared to their level, 3 approximate levels between A1 and A2. And they also had a very short questionnaire on the tests for the young learners and their teachers. The follow-up studies looked at the test data, task evaluation, also used think aloud protocol interviews and classroom observations. Now, this is the little questionnaire in Hungarian. You're not supposed to be familiar with the words. It was just a little face asking them to circle the number on the first scale, how easy and difficult it was. Easy, very easy 4, easy 3, difficult 2, very difficult 1. Familiar, unfamiliar, liked and disliked. And this was something that they had to circle after taking each and every task. And they actually really liked it because they were asked to give us feedback on how the tasks appealed to them. Now, here is an example of a writing test at the very low level. In this task, they were supposed to fill in missing letters, as many letters as lines. They knew these were all colors. The first item was always an example. And the letters we omitted were the typical letters which tended to give them a headache. Like in the very last word, number 9, orange, G in this word is something that Hungarian children find really difficult. So we try to put in difficult items as well as easy items, like pink in 5 is something that most children know right away. But most of the items were quite challenging. And we calculated all kinds of statistical data sets and also the means and standard deviations as to how they thought about each and every task. This is just an example of a very simple writing test. Or this was the listening anchor test. We had anchor tests for each skill, meaning that the 3 levels were linked together. And the very first and pretty easy item, we used IRT to level the items, minus 2.75. This was a bright color, the color of lemons, bananas, and some birds and flowers, and the fall leaves on the trees turned this color. So it was always a little description, a longish text that they heard, and they had to simply match what they heard with the item in a picture. So they did not need to do any reading. This was only listening. And as you can see, the very last item was the most difficult, although we thought this was going to be very easy for them. It was river, and we gave them names of Hungarian rivers as well as other names of rivers, and this proved to be the most difficult item. Now here is another listening test. In this task, they could look at all these pictures, and then they heard these statements, and their task was to match, this is a multiple matching task, to match what they heard with the actual picture. There was always one more item. So let me go back to the picture. And here are the statements. And he's playing football was the example. And we calculated all the statistical data. Or here is another listening task where they had to listen to definitions. And they had to match what they heard with the actual words that they could see on this list. We also calculated some correlations. We wanted to see the relationships between how easy they thought the actual task was, how familiar it was, and to what extent they liked them, and how these correlated with one another. And here are the main findings on students' feedback. We found the strongest relationships on the anchor task, and that was 6.645 between the actual and perceived task difficulty. And because of the IRT, we could also find out that the children could actually estimate quite well which task was difficult and which task was not so difficult. And there were moderate to weak relationships between the scores on difficulty, familiarity, and liking the tasks. Self-evaluation came out as something important because we found stronger relationships between the actual and perceived task difficulty than the other two criteria. Most of the tasks were familiar to the children, but there were some that they were not familiar with, and it did not seem to impact how well they could perform on the tasks. The difficulty levels seem to be mostly appropriate in this project. Now, we asked teachers to also comment on all the tasks. And as I said, out of the 61 teachers, 40 teachers gave us detailed explanations, mostly positive, overwhelmingly also negative, and some were geared towards some specific problems like the level of difficulty, etc. So let me show you some of the comments that the teachers came up with. Some of them were very positive. They really appreciated that the group was enthusiastic. They enjoyed doing them. Although some of them were not familiar, they thought that definitions were difficult, but the children could listen for keywords. In other words, this was also something for the teachers to realize that even if the text is longish and they don't expect the children to find the task difficult, they can do them because they can listen for the specific information in the item. They thought, some of them thought they were real up-to-date eye-catching tasks. There were some negative comments, mostly on self and peer assessment. They found giving points, in other words, to scoring, too long. They thought, some of them, that it was a waste of time, and correcting whatever was done too difficult and taking also a long time. Some of them did not think that the children could assess themselves. There was an oral task which was conducted in pairs, and some of the teachers were very upset by not being in control. Like this teacher here who said, it disturbed me like it did all teachers, I suppose, that I could not hear the answers. They wanted to hear everybody's speaking, whereas the tasks, the speaking tasks, were conducted in pairs. There were some other negative comments. I will not go into the details. I'm just trying to share with you the full picture. A recurring theme concerned what the children have not learned. The task type was unknown. Even the better students got stuck at first, but that means then they moved on. Or they pointed out what they have not taught the children. Or they know the word in speaking, but they could not spell the word. There were some other reflections which were triggered by the actual tasks. For example, the first comment, this is interesting because we learned parts of the body in October. We wrote a vocabulary test and some said they forgot how to spell the words. When I talked about the U-shape development, the teacher is surprised that what was practiced in October is not something kids can remember a few months later. or a teacher was surprised that what the children didn't know discouraged them. Now, I don't know what this teacher had been doing over the years. Of course, children are discouraged when they cannot do something. And one of them said, when a creative answer came up, like Bill is flying, she was ready to accept it as a correct answer, but I can't remember what that actually referred to. So in summary of the teachers' beliefs, many of the teachers emphasize that what the children have not learned formally because they did not teach that particular item was not known, so they just skipped it. They had, of course, the opportunity to skip it. Many of them said discussing the task and the children's performance was a waste of time. And this is where I have to disagree. Of course, it's not a waste of time. That's the point, that discussing how well they can do is part of assessment for learning. Some of them insisted that multiple meanings were unacceptable. They were upset when there were many different solutions that the children came up with, which in my view is just normal. They were worried that pair work means they lack control, and they did not think that peer and self-evaluation was such a good idea. And knowing English to most of these teachers meant knowing vocabulary and grammar. And some teachers were upset when the children could guess from context. They didn't appreciate the strategies that they could use. I will, I think, skip the case studies because I'm running out of time. But if anybody is interested, I'm happy to come back. So I would like to simply sum it up in a nutshell, the lessons and the implications for classroom teaching. Teaching and assessment are not separable. They go hand in hand. Diagnostic assessment for learning means scaffolding each and every learner's development, involving young learners in their own learning, and the assessment is a good idea. Actually, it can lead to motivation. The quality of teaching means how many learning opportunities we can offer our students. Experimenting with new tasks can lead to innovation. Some of the teachers we worked with, they fell in love with some of the task types, and they said they would want to use some later. And classroom research for teacher learning and development involves assessment for learning and giving feedback for learning. It is important to try to change, if necessary, teachers' and learners' beliefs and practices, which also means teaching the culture. And I assume my point is clear that diagnostic assessment and feedback for learning will and may hopefully lead to more and better learning for young learners as well as for their teachers, and they can both be more motivated in their actually pretty hard job. And that's what I thought I would share with you today.
Thank you, Marianne. It was a very, very nice presentation on how to work with assessment and feedback for young learners. And there are some questions in our feedback in our chat box, and I'm going to read them for you. So I would like to know your thoughts. Fatima is asking, some authors say feedback should be well planned. What do you think about that?
It depends on what we mean by well planned. Of course, you as a
planned
teacher,
in advance, probably.
Teachers have to be prepared to be able to give constructive, helpful, beneficial feedback. But you cannot prepare your feedback before you see what the children can do. You have to have some meaningful comments that you give the children so that they understand what you are trying to convey when you give them feedback. telling everybody that's wonderful all the time does not help anybody. Making sure that the children understand what they can do and what they actually need to improve is not treating them like underdogs. They are human beings who can, of course, pass a judgment on their own performances. Kids are smart, much smarter than we tend to assume.
Yep.
I don't know if this is a good answer.
Oh, it's a great answer. Okay. It makes us wonder and think about it. So it's a very, very good answer. Also, Albert is asking, considering the item which mentions the names of famous rivers, to what extent the cultural references helped or hindered learners' performance?
Well, the assumption and through the pilot, we expected the Hungarian cultural reference like Duna, Tisza, which are the most widely known, largest Hungarian rivers. The intention was to make sure that the background knowledge resonates. We also included the Amazon and some other item from some teaching material. I even remember some course book. Now I can't recall it. However, that particular item proved to be the most difficult across the 3 age groups. Clearly, not all the children were able to make the link between the word river, a stretch of water, with the particular name of the river. So that's why even when you design and pilot an item very carefully, you may realize that some children, let's say most probably the 3rd and 4th graders, had not a lot of ideas about Hungarian rivers, but the item worked well. It discriminated pretty well.
I see. So, well, there's another question from Naldo, still talking about content. So in contexts in which both language and content, other content, not related to language, is being taught, should feedback be given on language or on content, or both? Should there be a special focus on one of them?
Well, I think the answer is pretty obvious. Depending on what your purpose is, if you are teaching content, you are focusing on meaning, then keep focusing on meaning. However, you are the teacher whose role is to realize where the problem lies. If it's not only the content causing the problem, or you suspect it's not only the content, then you can also ask a question concerning the form. Or you can point out something or let them guess what the point related to the form is. In my own teaching practice, I have always focused on meaning, but I would always try to invite children to guess where the problem may be in the form. Because what they can guess themselves or what they can explain to one another is always more meaningful than what I can give them. And I can always say, yes, that's a brilliant idea. I never thought about it. And then they are also happy that they could come up with something like that.
Amazing. There's a question from Sandra. Marianne, as far as I understood, in your research, researchers themselves, not the teachers, developed and applied the tests. Has it caused any impact on students' results?
Every researcher we worked with were also teachers. I consider myself a teacher. I have some experience with, of course, very limited experience when you look at the world, but I have intensive experience with Hungarian learners, and I have learned through reading the literature about other learners. I think it's a must to include practicing teachers in everything. Practicing teachers are the key players. You can't do anything without teachers. If you as a test specialist are out there and you are hoping to feed teachers something that they will then use, I don't think it's a good approach. Has it caused any impact on the students' results? The tasks we came up with were meaning-focused, innovative tasks, some of them used in schools, some of them never used in schools, or sometimes used but never used for learning feedback and assessment for learning purposes. For example, TPR. TPR tends to be used as a group activity, but in our, it was a listening test, we gave teachers instructions what to use, and then to ask the children to tick the boxes where they did what the teacher modeled in the second round. In other words, the children were invited to check their own performance based on the teacher modeling the reactions to her own instructions. And that was, for example, one of the tasks where the teachers were quite surprised how much the children could understand and how well they could use this type of ticking technique. It's no big deal. Other teachers complained that it took a long time. Okay, life takes time. But if you benefit from the activity, you should consider using it. Probably if you cannot manage a task like this, then you should probably work on how to manage a task.
All right. And there's also another question. In your opinion, when planning a language lesson with young learners, how many feedback slots should the teacher include during the lesson? One after every task, or a larger slot at the end?
Yes, of course. You have to make sure with young learners that feedback is immediate. You cannot postpone it like, when I have more time, I'll give you feedback, or I'll take your whatever work home and next week I'll give you feedback on how well you performed. No, no, no. Children want feedback right there, right now. And I would want feedback right now. It's more efficient if you know what's going on. You will not remember. That's the point. In diagnostic assessment, you need immediate feedback. You cannot postpone it because then who remembers what it concerns?
Another one, how do you see the teacher education regarding teaching young learners nowadays?
Unfortunately, the situation is very, very similar to what it used to be many, many years ago. Most of the teachers, sorry?
Unfortunately.
That's what I'm saying, that
Yeah.
unfortunately, the themes are recurring over the decades. Not all teachers who are now teaching young learners want to teach young learners. They are teaching them because that's their job. However, I remember from one particular study where teachers complained about not being able to use the bathroom in the break. Or I remember from my own practice, I was able to sit down in my own class first when they were in grade 6, not before, ever. You have to be on your toes all the time. You have to keep, you only have 2 eyes, but you have to keep your 2 eyes on everybody all the time. And classroom management is something that people who are used to nicely behaving or just bored adults who don't misbehave, you will be very disappointed by what the job requires. You really have to have a lot of energy. You have to be ready to change activities the minute you notice that children are losing it. And if you fail to change activities, you are lost. That's the end of your nicely designed lesson. It's a very demanding job.
It is.
And you cannot do it like forever unless you are the most exceptional patient person. You need to have a lot of patience with every human being, but with younger children especially.
All right. There are more questions coming up.
Okay.
Deborah is asking, think about that child whose results are never good enough and he or she realizes that. How can we give a positive feedback?
I think most children, in my own experience, always benefited from a little partnership activity. I would ask for volunteers, somebody else to work with the child from the group, and I would set a little reward for both of them. If the child improved on the whatever task we were doing because they practiced together, I wanted to know how they did it. And sometimes I learned things I would not have guessed by myself. But I agree, there are some children who mustn't be left behind, and they realize that they are slower. We know from research that the main individual differences are in the rate of learning. So the slow learner, who is, as Deborah words it, the child who will never get positive feedback, you can compare the child to their own achievement the day before or 2 days before, and they will see that they are making some progress. Yeah, I fully agree. The picture is really varied, and there are some children whose development is so slow that they really take like 3 times longer than the others. Then the question is whether you or somebody else has that much time. But giving them the opportunity, I have seen children blossom very unexpectedly. Children who I never said it aloud, but I thought like, oh my goodness, poor thing. He or she will never get there. And then in just a couple of months, they just blossomed. I don't know how. I asked the parents, they had no idea. There was no particular change. That's why I keep mentioning this U-shaped development. It's oftentimes hard to explain how it works. You have to have case studies that you follow through over not just months, but years. But I agree, yes, you are right. Giving positive feedback to everybody is challenging, and especially giving finely tuned feedback that it's really meaningful. It's not always the good job, which doesn't mean a lot after a while.
How do you see the results of your research impacting teacher education in the future? In other words, are there any professional development programs in the pipeline for those practicing teachers?
I'm sure there are extremely meaningful and helpful teacher education programs being implemented around the globe. And as now we have millions of young learners, especially learning English, and many of them actually do develop, so those teachers must be pretty good. However, as a teacher educator, I must say that many of the teachers I used to work with as would-be teachers, and then my new students observed a few years later, many of them applied techniques. They were fully aware of being useless, inappropriate, and they admitted that they fell into practices because of pressure. Pressure from colleagues to follow the course book, which was not terribly good. Pressure from parents who wanted to check boxes and why didn't you do one exercise and the other. And time pressure, simply applying, for example, translation with young learners is often seen as a shortcut because thinking about other ways takes longer. And before you come up with your idea, the children are already all over the place. And that's why I keep saying that it's not enough to be proficient in the target language. You also have to be able to understand what the children say, talk about, how they misbehave. You have to be, of course, culturally fully aware. And you have to have all those tricks you can pull out of your bag and make sure that you can establish an atmosphere where children can learn. I wouldn't use the word discipline. What I'm saying is a healthy condition for everybody to be able to learn. And that's not easy. The way I acquired my techniques, I observed two extremely good lower primary teachers because I had no idea when I was a beginner. And I was fully aware of my weaknesses, and I wanted to see how other people do it. Somebody is asking when children in Hungary start learning English. That's a very confusing picture. According to the national curriculum, it's still from grade 4, age 10. However, the vast majority of parents who want a brighter future for their children push them into earlier programs, typically from grade 1 or nowadays even in kindergarten.